I went on 2 dates with the Long Island serial killer many years ago when I was young and poor and living in Manhattan. He drugged me on the first date, and I still went out with him again because, well, I was poor. The second time he was extremely weird, asking me to go to his Long Island beach house with him, being very demanding, then got into a physical fight with someone at the bar we were at which point I ran home as fast as I could and never spoke to him again. One of my girlfriends back then was a lawyer and was urging me to contact law enforcement because she was certain he was the guy who was murdering all those women and dumping them on Gilgo Beach. I thought she was being ridiculous. The day he was caught, another friend messaged me an article, and I immediately threw up at seeing the image of him in handcuffs. I was sick the whole day. My dad is 99% sure he was approached by Jeffrey Dahmer in 1978 while he was a freshman in college at Ohio State. This is Dead Air and True Stories of Brushes with Danger. My boyfriend at the time, who is now my husband, worked for the County Road Commission, and one day, while driving in his work truck on the freeway, saw a woman hitchhiking. On a whim, he decided to pick her up. He said she sat facing him in the passenger seat, staring him down intensely the whole time. She asked if he was looking for a good time, and he declined. He let her off a couple of miles down the road. Several years later, Aileen Wuornos made the news, charged with killing several men. My BF said he almost choked on his food when he saw her on television. The image of that intense stare and those crazy eyes was something not easily forgotten. I knew someone during my partying era who survived an encounter with Stephen Port, who was known as the Grinder Killer. He woke up from the fatal GHB dose because he was an addict and managed to escape. His drug problem saved his life, LOL. I encountered the Golden State Killer when he was captured. New memories came pouring in, and I deeply suspect that I met him in the late 1990s while hitchhiking out of the Sacramento airport. Photos of him post-arrest clearly confirmed to me that he was the man who had picked me up and tried to get me to allow him to suck my dick on the creepiest ride of my life. Was I scared for my life? You bet I was. I called the FBI twice, once before he was arrested, and again after, and to this day I believe there are more victims, men, that they are missing. My mother was out at a bar in Atlanta in her mid-20s in the 1970s and started chatting with a young lawyer at the bar. She said he was incredibly smart and charming. He complimented her fingernails though, and she thought that was a bit off. He invited her to go to a different bar in his car, and she declined. She couldn't stop thinking about him for weeks and regretted not going with him. She and her best friend drove all over Atlanta checking bar parking lots for his car, hoping for another chance with him. She hadn't gone outside to see his car, but he described it, so she was looking for that make and model. She never saw him again. Then a couple of years later, she saw him on TV. She thought, I knew that young lawyer would be famous someday. It was Ted Bundy, defending himself in his murder trial. My friend's dad was locker neighbors with Paul Bernardo, and my mother worked in the area he was active before she became pregnant with me. Everyone was very much on guard. The area wasn't a good one to begin with. She worked at a bank, and one of her co-workers looked a lot like the composite sketch. Safe to say he got a lot of concerned glances. My sister-in-law encountered Ivan Milat, one of the two men that inspired the Wolf Creek series. She was traveling the east coast of Australia for a few weeks with her brother. One night, her and her brother were having jerky and beer by a campfire when Milat sat down at their campfire. When she first saw him, she thought he was park ranger because of his style of dress. She thought he was going to tell them that they built their campfire in a prohibited area, but instead he commented on what a beautiful evening it was and pointed out some of the notable stars in the sky. Ivan never properly introduced himself. He just sat down and started chatting. He asked my sister-in-law where she was from, and she told him Darwin. He said, "What's a Darwin girl doing all the way out here?" My sister-in-law explained that she was on a road trip. She seemed to pique his interest when she told him that instead of doing the usual beach vacation, she wanted to do something a little more rugged, like explore caves, do a little rock climbing, and hike trails that were not popular with the tourists. My sister-in-law says that Ivan was friendly, and he had a lot of ideas about places she might like to go, including a cave that had a waterfall inside, which was a bit of a hidden gem not well known to tourists. She felt comfortable talking with him, and when he invited her and her brother to join him at his campsite for some rabbit stew and beer, she would have said yes, but her brother instantly turned him down. Ivan's response to the rejection was a slight, "Well, I tried," shrug of the shoulders. He went back to his campsite, and her brother quickly packed their things in their rented Land Rover, and they wound up sleeping in the Rover outside a well-lit gas station that night. She said what was so scary about that night is that she felt almost immediately comfortable around Ivan. No red flags whatsoever. He reminded her of one of her uncles that worked construction, one of those rugged but worldly kind of guys, while her brother was immediately suspicious of the charming stranger. She kind of wonders what would have happened to her if her brother had not been there that night. I worked at the same place as Gary Ridgway for a while. Didn't know him well, but well enough to greet him by name if I saw him in the facility. We called him GR, which was short for Green River. At that point, he had been a suspect in the Green River killings, but we all thought he had been cleared because the police questioned but did not arrest him. In reality, they still suspected him but did not have any evidence, which is a big difference. He was a hard worker and pretty introverted. Didn't say much but wasn't unfriendly. I went to work someplace else, and he was arrested about a year later. It was quite shocking. We had an older family friend who grew up in Muchmarkle, near to Fred West's childhood home. She said the whole family were very, very odd, and that Fred got his sister pregnant when they were young teenagers. She wasn't remotely surprised that he went on to do what he did. My auntie was followed home and chased by Clifford Olson in Vancouver, BC in the early 80s when she was 13. He followed her home from school in his car, then pulled up beside her and offered her a ride. When she refused, he exposed himself and started, well, you know. She ran away and he got out of the car and chased her through a park. She managed to cut through a pathway to a friend's backyard and got to safety, but she was almost taken by him. He was known as the Beast of British Columbia and is responsible for the murders of at least 11 victims. When I was about 5 years old and staying at the Cedar Lodge Motel in Yosemite, I met Cary Stayner. We had a late check-in, and the moment we arrived, my mom said that she immediately had her teeth on edge. She absolutely did not want to stay there, but my dad was tired and they had reservations, so he told her we'd stay for the night and find another place in the morning. The whole time we were checking in, my mom held my hand and my sister's hand super tight and refused to let go of us. After checking in, we went to the pool to try and calm down, and my mom realized we didn't have enough towels. She called the front desk and they sent someone over. The moment he walked up to my mom, she immediately got like full body chills and just all the hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she basically snatched the towels out of the man's hands and yelled for us to get out of the pool. She told us that she just felt pure evil radiating off the man and that she felt like throwing up from him looking at us. That night, she made all 3 of us kids sleep in the bed with her and my dad, and she made my dad help her push the dresser in front of the door, which, considering my parents' house burned down only 5 years before that, with my parents and sister all trapped on the top floor, was a big deal for her. We ended up checking out as early as possible the next morning and going to a different hotel. My mom says she couldn't breathe until we were far away from the Cedar Lodge. About 2 months later, my parents were watching the news when a report came in about murdered women and 2 young girls in Yosemite. My mom turned to my dad and said, "I bet it happened at the Cedar Lodge." And sure enough, the news reporter flashed to the motel and the man who had brought us our towels, Cary Stayner. My mom swears that she just knew from the moment she stepped foot on the property that there was evil there, and she's adamant that if every bone in your body is telling you to run, you fucking run. My mom pegged Cary Stayner to be a serial killer and was right. My mom helped catch Wesley Allen Dodd. My mom was with her boyfriend at the time at a movie theater in Camas, Washington. Her boyfriend was fucking huge. The dude was a bounty hunter with my dad back in the day. Anyways, this little boy runs out of the bathroom screaming that someone was trying to take him. Dodd came out of the bathroom and the child confirmed that it was him. Cue my mom's boyfriend and everyone else beating the fuck out of Dodd. Had the police not stopped them, he would have died right there. But alas, the police arrived and he was taken into custody. I guess once he was in the cop car, he just said, "You know I killed those kids, right?" referencing missing boys in the area. I've shaken hands with BTK multiple times. I had friends that knew him and said he was an asshole, but I knew him when I was a high schooler. He cooked burgers at the church across the street. Once a month, the school did a field trip to the church over lunch for a burger and a sermon type thing. He always seemed nice to me. My friend is 100% sure she met Charles Manson in the 60s when he was still a bum, just drifting from place to place, I guess between stints in jail. He was known to have been in West Virginia for a while, and she was living at the time in a small suburb of the capital, Charleston, and was maybe 12 or 13. She said she went to her school friend's apartment after school one day. This friend had a divorced mom who was very much a hippie. She said there were 2 or 3 people there that day she didn't know and had never seen before, including him. She said he was unkempt, small for a man, and looked very much like a scruffy homeless person, but gave off a very quiet but intense vibe. He never said much, and she said with them just being kids in and out, no one paid any attention to them, like he was just listening to everyone and not saying anything himself. Fast forward to the murders in California years later, when his picture was on every TV in the nation, and she remembered him distinctly. That man was once in my friend's house. Nothing had happened. The 3 of them spent a few nights just couch surfing, and they just up and left after a couple of days. She thankfully never saw him again. Also, a guy I knew, much younger than me, who had gone into the military, was in boot camp with Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City Federal Building bomber. He didn't know him too well, and of course they were sent in different places immediately afterwards, but he said McVeigh was a good and efficient soldier, very quiet, followed orders, didn't make any waves or trouble, was simply another average G.I. Joe. Since he didn't attract attention at all, no one had a clue he was on track, or already had begun to develop the thoughts and ideologies that he did. He kept everything to himself. They always seemed quiet, at least at first. My dad and his brother were both picked up on separate occasions by John Wayne Gacy. They grew up in the same area as him around the time he was out and about. My dad was a teenager in the late 70s. The story as my dad tells it is that one day he was trying to get a ride home and resorted to hitchhiking, which he did pretty regularly in those days. He got picked up by a guy in a station wagon and immediately knew the vibes were off. He said there was an assortment of weird knick-knacks on the dashboard, which was the first warning sign. Then the driver started asking strange questions about sex and just generally being weird. Can't recall any specifics on that. The guy asked him his name, and my dad didn't want to give his name, so he gave his brother's name. About 10 minutes into the car ride, my dad knew he needed out, so when they were at a stoplight, he booked it. Separately, my uncle, my dad's brother, had the exact same experience to a T. My uncle had the same thought not to give his name, so he told him my dad's name. Neither my dad or my uncle told anyone about these encounters until years later. They went like 10 years without telling each other about it. A few years after each had their scary experience, the news broke about John Wayne Gacy, and they both knew immediately that it was the driver of the car they hitchhiked with. Both of them could have very easily been his victims. I was a classmate of the Virginia Tech shooter, Cho Seung-hui. Guy gave everyone bad vibes from day one. One of our professors had him removed from her class because his behavior was so disturbing. Another went to the police because of his violent writings. A female classmate called the police on him after he turned up at her dorm room door out of nowhere. Obviously, none of this was enough for law enforcement to take any real action because he was able to murder 32 people. My father was in the Canadian Air Force and met Russell Williams, a Canadian serial killer, and my father's wing commander the night that Williams murdered Marie-France Comeau. Apparently Williams murdered Comeau earlier in the day and then showed up at a party on base later that night to make everything seem normal. My father, as well as several other of his co-workers and military officers, shook hands and made small talk with Williams all night, not knowing that Comeau's blood was literally on his hands. I waltzed with Ed Gain. He was a resident of a psychiatric facility, and I was a student rotating through the ward. On Fridays, there was a dance social for the sake of therapeutic recreation, and all students were forced to participate. As I recall, each student was required to allow themselves to be clumped onto and dragged across the linoleum floor by 3 residents. Ed was not a good dancer. I have 2 separate family members who have encountered 2 separate serial killers. My auntie was nearly a victim of the Moors murderers. She was walking home from school one day when a Land Rover pulled up next to her and the window rolled down. There was a lady driving. She told my auntie to get in and she'd drive her home from school. My auntie said she didn't get in cars with strangers. The woman said that she was a family friend and my grandma had sent her to pick her up. My auntie noticed that there was a motorbike parked just up the road and the rider was watching this go on. She had the good sense to run into a nearby shop and didn't come out till they left. Sure enough, a year or so later, she saw the woman's face all over the news. It was Myra Hindley. It also came out that while Myra was luring victims into the car, Ian Brady would follow behind on his motorbike. My auntie says she just instinctively felt there was something very off about the situation and that the woman seemed too keen to get her in the car. The other is my grandmother on my mum's side, who was a patient of Harold Shipman in the early 90s. When he was arrested, she was shocked. She said he was always very polite and gentle with her and really seemed to know his stuff. She complained for years that she could never find a doctor as good as he'd been. It was very funny. She kept swapping doctors because none of them are as nice as Dr. Shipman was. They don't listen properly. We had to point out that there was every possibility he was being nice, so she'd ask if he did house calls. My mum was a nurse back in the 1960s and 70s until she got married and had us Sprogs. She was from Bradford and worked at the Bradford Royal Infirmary. I don't know the exact circumstances as to why he was there. Related to someone or friends with someone who worked there, perhaps. But at the height of the Yorkshire Ripper murders, Peter Sutcliffe used to give the nurses lifts home so that they'd be safe from the Ripper. I grew up about a block and a half from Bob Badella in Kansas City. Years later, he was arrested for a series of crimes involving young men he had picked up around town. Before that, from what I remember, he seemed like a fairly normal and even social person. He was part of the neighborhood watch group that my dad belonged to. He also ran an oddities booth at the flea market near our house called Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, which in hindsight seems a little strange. I still remember the day he was caught. I was playing at a friend's house whose father was a police sergeant. There was frantic knocking at the front door, and about 30 seconds later, my friend's dad told us to go play at my house for a while. One of the people he had been holding managed to escape by climbing out of a second-floor window while Berdella was at work. The man, barely dressed, ran across the street and started pounding on doors. The first people who answered lived next door to the house I was playing at, and they immediately went to get help, knowing a police officer lived there. So Berdella had been living across from a police sergeant for years, while something terrible was happening inside that house, and no one realized. This all happened right as school was getting out for the summer, and my parents let us stay home while they worked, instead of sending us to daycare. Most days we'd hang out in the backyard behind Berdella's house, which was slightly elevated above his, watching investigators search the property. My mom later said the number of police officers in the neighborhood for the next 2 months was so large that we were probably safer there than we would have been anywhere else.
William Bonin, also known as the Freeway Killer, killed my childhood friend in 1980. He was 16. I was 15 at the time, and that is too young an age to wrap your head around having a friend be a victim of a serial killer. It changed me. And Steve was only hitchhiking to get back to school after a dental appointment. It was okay to hitchhike in those days and considered safer. And Steve was a small guy and probably an easy target. My dad, who is now deceased, worked on a construction crew with David Berkowitz, the murderer known as the Son of Sam killer. My dad said Berkowitz opened his jacket and showed him his gun. My father's response was, "You're a crazy son of a bitch," and walked away. He loved telling us that story. My old teacher ran into a man in a park trying to pull his rowboat out of a pond while out on a run. He saw her and asked for her help. His arm was in a cast, which was the detail that made her realize there was something off about the situation. A rowboat requires both arms to operate. She refused, but said she would find somebody stronger who could help him, and kept running. Later, news reports identified that familiar creep as Ted Bundy. Derek Todd Lee, who was known as the Baton Rouge serial killer, was active in the early 2000s in Baton Rouge. He targeted women, typically brunettes, and typically from wealthier neighborhoods. My girlfriend fit the first descriptor, and when she was house-sitting for her extremely wealthy aunt, the second too, she called me, saying she was being followed by a white truck, which the authorities said may be the killer's vehicle, and no matter where she went, it was following her. I raced across town and got to her aunt's neighborhood, and she pulled onto the street with a white truck right behind her. She pulled onto the driveway and ran into the house, and the truck stopped one house before her aunt's house on the opposite side of the street, which was a lake with no special stopping point there. I told girlfriend that this was probably a misunderstanding and approached the vehicle from a very obvious angle, hands in clear view, and announced loudly, "I don't know who you are, but you were following the wrong person tonight and you freaked her out." It was a neighborhood around Louisiana State University, and students there do stupid stuff all the time, and the authorities said the killer was most likely a white male, while the driver was African American. He looked at me side-eyed, paused for a moment, and then drove off. I didn't see the guy again until he was on the front page of the newspaper, arrested as the Baton Rouge serial killer. You've been listening to Dead Air. Like and subscribe for more. Good night.